Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I am your host, as always, Josh Larky, and I am joined, as always, by Ryan Reynolds. Today, we have a special guest, the 33rd Team Zone, a contributor at many other places, kind of a singular figure in his own right as well, Alex Caruso. Make sure you're following him on Twitter at Alex Caruso. Alex, we're diving right in because you are very high on Lions rookie running back Jahmyr Gibbs. You have a free draft guide. If people go to your Twitter, they can pretty easily download it. It's your pinned tweet. And I liked your write-up on Gibbs in the draft guide. Give us a quick hitter on why the Lions rookie running back is a very solid pick in fantasy football.
Yeah, I think it's fair to argue that NFL teams are probably a little bit smarter than we are as fantasy football analysts. And what we found over the last decade is when it comes to running backs, draft capital matters. Every running back drafted 12th or higher, which is where Gibbs got drafted since 2012, finished as the running back 11 or better every year. Those 8 running backs, every single one finished as a top 11 running back drafted that high. Beyond that, the Lions last year were second in expected running back fantasy points. DeAndre Swift was a top 20 running back every year in that role. And I think that I would argue that Jahmyr Gibbs is probably a better prospect and a better pass catcher than DeAndre Swift was. And I think with Jameson Williams also being out, with them having a rookie tight end and not TJ Hawkinson, I think that gives him more and more of an opportunity to see a bigger target share. So off draft capital, off the team situation, and what the Lions running backs do for expected fantasy points every year, I think those are all reasons why I'm on Jahmyr Gibbs.
Trevor Lawrence had a big sophomore season last year, struggled in the, Urban Meyer mess his rookie season. I'd frame Trevor Lawrence as an Andrew Luck level quarterback prospect. So this ascension isn't really too big of a surprise. Good athlete. He's already knocking on the door of being an elite passer at this point. Now, Alex, you love the Jaguars offense this year. Which piece of this passing attack are you targeting in fantasy football?
I think there's 2. I mean, one has to be Calvin Ridley. I mean, I think you just look at what they did. So again, first of all, Trevor Lawrence is still getting better. He made a big jump from year 1 to year 2. I think it's pretty easy to assume that he's going to take a jump from year 2 to year 3, especially when you add in someone like Calvin Ridley. But if you look back at Calvin Ridley versus Christian Kirk, I mean, in all 4 seasons that they've both played, Calvin Ridley was a better receiver in fantasy points per game every single year of their careers. And then if Christian Kirk and Zay Jones were the wide receiver 11 and wide receiver 26 last year, and then Ridley is better than Kirk and Kirk is better than Zay Jones and Trevor Lawrence is still getting better, logic would assume that then those guys are both really great picks because they're going later than that right now at ADP. And again, if Zay Jones and Christian Kirk were able to produce, I think that Ridley and Kirk plus Lawrence getting better could take that to another level this year.
Yeah, the Jaguars are a team Ryan and I have talked about where you definitely do not want to bet against them this year. Weak division, great schedule, and most pieces in this offense really do look like they're ascending. And guys, reminder before we keep going, follow Alex at Alex Caruso on Twitter. If you're not one of the 90,000 that's already following him, rectify that immediately. Ryan is at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Now, if we look at the Carolina Panthers and their running back Miles Sanders, well, last year, Miles Sanders was not a Panther. He was an Eagle. He was the RB16 per game in half PPR. That's not very exciting. It was even worse. We know he didn't catch passes. He was the RB21 per game in PPR leagues last year on the Eagles. He struggles in pass protection. I would actually argue that that's a huge concern now because we have the undersized Bryce Young, a rookie quarterback who's probably going to weigh in around 190, 195 every Sunday. If he blows a pass block and Bryce Young takes some pretty unnecessary contact, it's hard to see them saying, you know what, let's keep Miles Sanders out on the field, give him another chance because of running back fantasy points through the pass game. At the end of the day, the Panthers look like kind of a below average offense. Where's the touchdown upside? I don't see the receptions coming into place. Alex, you also do not like Miles Sanders in fantasy football. What else do you want to add? Let's just pile on. Give me 1 or 2 more reasons why we should be fading this guy.
Well, I think one of the things is that Cody Carpentier had reported before Sanders was hurt that he was splitting work with Chuba Hubbard. Like, I know that like his entire ADP right now exists off of one 50-second clip of the Panthers GM saying that they want him to be a 3-down back. We have not heard those reports. We have not seen that in camp when there's being reports that they were splitting work already. And then you throw in the fact that like Miles Sanders did not play in a preseason game. He's already dealing with a groin injury. And even in the last 2 years combined, he was one of the worst running backs in the NFL in yards after contact per rush. And who did he play behind? Well, he played behind the number 1 offensive line in the NFL, which made him in turn look a lot better. I think that the idea of him being a 3-down workhorse is really nice, but I don't think that he was actually that great. And it wasn't until they had like one of the best rushing quarterbacks in the NFL and the number 1 offensive line that he was finally productive. And even so, he was the running back 17, I think, for the year. So like, what's the ceiling playing behind a much worse team and probably a much worse role?
Follow Alex Caruso at Alex Caruso on Twitter. I tell you, Alex, not many people sway me on players, and I'm going to be targeting Chuba Hubbard more at the end of drafts based on what you just said. Now, Alex, I'm a Giants fan. The Brian Daboll and Joe Shane installment last year has made my personal life better. I can enjoy football Sundays again. The Giants are well ran. Now, to that end, they traded for Darren Waller. Josh has been above consensus on Waller since that moment. Josh has Waller up to tight end 4 now. I was in a FFPC main event last night. Waller's up to tight end 4 in high stakes leagues too right now. You have Darren Waller at tight end 3. Why is that?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with just the fact, like, again, the Brian Daboll thing makes a big difference. I mean, we saw in the first, like, how he developed Josh Allen, and like when he was there, like Josh Allen made a big jump every year. Again, emphasis on big jump. He doesn't need Daniel Jones doesn't need to be Josh Allen.
Right.
But like with Brian Daboll, like he made big strides last year. He had the best season of his career last year in his first year with Brian Daboll. They add in Darren Waller, who has pretty much been a top 5 tight end in fantasy points per game for 4 straight years. He's been like the most consistent tight end in fantasy football. All we've heard from beat reporters the entirety of the offseason is about the connection between Darren Waller and Daniel Jones. And then in one preseason game, we saw Darren Waller be targeted on over 40% of his routes. So we have the reports, we have the preseason usage, we have the fact that Brian Daboll has only elevated like his quarterbacks and the players around them in their scheme. And then the fact that Darren Waller has just so happened to be a top 5 tight end pretty much in fantasy points per game each of the last 4 years. I mean, why are we not drafting this guy, especially when George Kittle has much more competition for targets? TJ Hawkinson has never had a super high target share. And Kyle Pitts, I think, has like one of the worst starting quarterbacks in all of football. Again, that means Darren Waller rises up my ranks.
Yeah, before we move on, the 2019 and 2020 Darren Waller seasons, which is when we really saw him break out, he would have been the tight end 2 in fantasy points per game last year if we took either of those seasons. One of those seasons, I believe he only had 2 touchdowns. So that's just like if he can be the tight end 2 in 2022 based on usage potentially, that to me is just, oof, I want that guy in fantasy football. Now, this might get contentious because I really like Jamaal Williams. Ryan really likes Jamaal Williams. I'm not quite sure if you like Jamaal Williams. So what I like about Jamaal Williams, I'm just going to sway the audience here. What we want in our later round picks in fantasy is we want a guy that we are like, you know what? There is an obvious way that we are starting him in fantasy football. That's kind of what you want from your late picks. I view Jamaal Williams as a guy where at least those first 3 weeks while Kamara is suspended, I am starting him on what should be a pretty good Saints rush attack. He's great in all phases. The rookie Kendre Miller's come along slowly. He had a knee sprain. He dealt with some immaturity earlier in camp. I have Jamaal Williams at RB 37 right now. You can check out my free fantasy football cheat sheet, color-coded PDF, download it. It's great. You can also look at Alex's draft rankings. Are also free. Great. Click on his pinned tweet at Alex Caruso, download them. But then Alex has Jamaal Williams at RB 44. I am going to make a point that these 7 spots matter. Maybe they don't matter. Why do you hate Jamaal Williams as a person, as a player, and as a fantasy football pick?
I mean, you're right. I do hate Jamaal Williams in every single aspect of his life, and there's nothing I enjoy about him whatsoever, especially for fantasy football purposes. And I just think that, like, I just don't think that he could have possibly been in like a worse role for fantasy football. I think this is one of the like most diabolical landing spots that he could have had. And I think that the upside is really nice because Alvin Kamara is gone for 3 games, but don't forget Alvin Kamara has been the running back 13 or better in points per game every year of his career. They also have notorious touchdown stealer Taysom Hill, along with drafting a running back in the 3rd round. Like Jamaal Williams did not play with Taysom Hill last year. He played with DeAndre Swift, who was always hurt. They didn't trust him on the goal line. And that's why Jamaal Williams saw that role consistently. Beyond that, they drafted a running back in the 3rd round for a reason. And I know Kendre Miller, I was concerned about the injury, but he already came back and played in the preseason. He is only going to get better. And I think for me with Jamaal Williams, like we've seen one real season where he averaged like over 10 fantasy points per game. And I think that ultimately he's been mostly a 0. So again, if you want to play the first 3 weeks of fantasy football, 100%. But I think that by the end of the season, when you're in the playoffs, trying to win your league, Alvin Kamara or someone like Kendre Miller, who's only going to get better, is more likely to be a league winner.
I like that. Alex. As someone who's been bullish on Jamaal Williams, just scared me a little bit there. I got to be honest with you. Now,
Yeah, me too.
I'll give you this. One of the reasons why I'm bullish on all the Saints is they have the league's easiest schedule. Philly benefited from this last year. I actually think the Saints have even more cupcakes than the Eagles did last year, maybe even by a considerable margin. So that's one of the reasons I'm interested in Jamaal Williams. It's also one of the reasons I've been bullish on Chris Olave since the schedule release in May. I bet on Chris Olave to win the Offensive Player of the Year at 75-1. Then I get it 70-1. That's in the 50-1 range now. I love life a lot in fantasy football when I could take him at the 2-3 turn. He's risen the ranks a little bit since then. What are your thoughts on Chris Olave at his current ADP around 20-ish, maybe above that?
I couldn't be more in on Chris Olave. I mean, he put himself in historic company last year. He had a 2.42 yards per route run. Even if you don't even know what that stat means, just know that any wide receiver who's been over 2.25 in their rookie year, all 5 of them to do it, all finished as a top 7 wide receiver in their second year. That list was Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, Odell Beckham, and A.J. Brown. That is the entire list. He also led the NFL in receiving routes per route versus man coverage. He was 8th in air yards as a rookie. And then you throw in the fact that Derek Carr has been one of the better deep ball passers in the NFL for the last few years. But if that doesn't convince you alone, just think about the fact that Derek Carr loves his number 1 target more than almost any player in the NFL. Darren Waller in 2019 and 2020 was a top 5 tight end. Devontae Adams in 2022 was a top 5 wide receiver. And then Hunter Renfrow was the wide receiver 11 in 2021. All he's done is produce a top 12 option at 8 position each of the last 4 years. I think that is Chris Olave's floor. And with that historic company, I think he could take another leap and do a top 7 or top 5 wide receiver if everything goes right.
It's good to hear. I know Ryan and I have both been packing our bags filled with a lot of Chris Olave kind of at the end of round 2, early round 3. Before we keep going, we have a free Discord. We talk fantasy football in there. We'll rate your draft if you want us to. You could rate our draft if you want to do that. We'll have prop bets throughout the NFL season. To 15 pretty high quality prop bets that were hitting around 60% last year. Then that's probably a pretty good place to get them. These are not us taking minus 150, minus 200 plays. We were generally hitting around minus 105, minus 110. What we were doing, I think it was pretty good. We want to share that with you. Hop in the Discord. We'll have start, sit, trade talks in there throughout the year. I'd say the easiest way to join that is just go to my Twitter at JLarkyTweets, and you'll see a little link tree right there with a nice clickable link to hop into this free Discord. If you have Discord, I don't know why you wouldn't be in there at this point. Now, Alex, we're both running back archetype guys. Running back spike weeks are generally going to come from red zone and goal line touches, like the touchdown upside. That's where a lot of fantasy points are scored. And from involvement in the passing game and getting heavily targeted. Now, who's a running back going outside the first 5 rounds of fantasy drafts that you believe is in line for goal line work and pass game targets? Essentially, this running back archetype is the guy that is getting both types of high value touches: pass game involvement, goal line opportunities.
There's 2 that I'd like to give kind of one and one together that I both really love. I mean, the first has to be James Conner. I mean, last year not even last year. He has been a top 10 running back in fantasy points per game each of the last 2 years. He has been a top 25 running back in fantasy points per game for 5 straight years, and he still goes outside the top 25. He's also like the concern is, Kyler Murray, bad offense. No problem. He's been the number 1 running back in all of fantasy football. He would have been the running back 1 in points per game in 2021 and 2022 in games where Kyler Murray has missed. And if you're still not convinced, how about the fact that if you look over the last decade, there's been 100 running backs to average about 16 touches per game. all of them but one finishes a top 20 running back. The worst finish among every single one of those players was Ray Rice at running back 24. Like, we're not even talking about talent, really. Like, this is just purely off production, what Connor's done the last couple of years, and he's going to continue to keep doing. The other guy for me has to be Javonte Williams, who every time on the field we've seen him take over pass catching work, and through one preseason game, he already outsnapped Samaje Perine. The whole narrative storyline that fantasy football people have been talking about for the last few months is it's going to take him games to ramp up, and Samaje Perine is going to be the guy. But it took one game for him to outsnap him in the preseason, and that says to me that they want to use this guy early and often. Still not convinced on him. Sean Payton, the head coach of the Broncos, has been a head coach for 15 seasons. He has produced a top 20 running back finish in 14 of the last 15 years. That includes injury. And he has had a top 20 guy in all but one season, which was 2009.
I'll add to that too. The Broncos upgraded their offensive line. That's a staple of Sean Payton teams. So I like that. Follow J Larky tweets on Twitter. Follow Alex Caruso as well. Now, Alex, actually, both of you guys have Amon-Ra St. Brown as a first-round pick. Thankfully for most of us that are paying attention, we can get Amon-Ra in the second round in most home leagues, at least for now. I assume that's going to correct at some point. I bet on Amon-Ra as the offensive player of the year, in part because he's a coworker, in part because this guy's drawing live at leading the league in receptions. With Jameson Williams suspended, outside of Jahmyr Gibbs, like you mentioned before, Amon-Ra is the only game in town for this passing attack for this first 6 weeks. Now, what's the realistic floor and ceiling for the Sun God this season, Alex?
The floor is a top 12 wide receiver. I mean, you look at when he broke out in week 10 or week 11 of 2021, there's only been 2 wide receivers in the NFL to score more fantasy points since he broke out in his rookie year. And that was Devontae Adams and Justin Jefferson. Those are the only guys to outscore him since the back half of his rookie year and his second year. So he also tied the NFL record for most receptions through a player's first 2 seasons. He made a big jump from year 1 to year 2 and has pretty much been productive since the back half of his rookie year. Like, the worst that happens is literally him being a top 12 wide receiver as long as he's healthy. And the ceiling is, I think that, like, if something happened and Justin Jefferson missed like 2 games, I think there's a chance that he could be the wide receiver 1 overall. I think he has that in his range of outcomes by the guys that he has around them and the fact that he made such a huge jump from year 1 to year 2, and he could make a similar jump maybe in year 2 to year 3.
Yeah, Amon-Ra St. Brown is also a coworker of ours at the 33rd team, and I bet on him 18-1 to lead the NFL in receptions. He had 106 last year. He missed a game, and he barely played in 2 other games. So if we look at the 14 full games he played, he had 101 receptions in those 14 games, and that was in year 2. I think we'd all agree that there's a chance he gets better in year 3. Now, I know Ryan and I recently, we've been more of a Brian Robinson type of guy than an Antonio Gibson guy. Brian Robinson was shot last preseason. He returns after 5 weeks, and then he plays in 12 games and averages more than 17 carries a game, 6th highest in the NFL. Remarkable. His final year at Alabama in 2021, Robinson had more than 1,300 rushing yards, but he also chipped in 35 receptions, which was 4th on the team that year. I view Brian Robinson as a 3-down back if Antonio Gibson gets hurt. That being said, I do believe that if Robinson gets hurt, Gibson could also be a workhorse. And I know everyone out there likes to take digs at fantasy analysts. You win there. I am a chicken because I have Robinson ranked only 1 spot ahead of Gibson because I see the upside with both. But Alex, you actually have Antonio Gibson 5 spots ahead of Robinson in your rankings. Make the case for why Gibson should be the preferred option for 2023.
Well, first of all, I've grown on Brian Robinson a lot. There was a much bigger gap in my rankings, but I've started to kind of see the light that you just talked about with Brian Robinson, which is really interesting. But I like Antonio Gibson a little bit more for a couple reasons. I mean, number one, it's like Eric Bieniemy's history, just like the last 2 years with pass catching running backs. I understand that was with the Chiefs. Like, I know, like, this is not Patrick Mahomes. But, I mean, he helped Darrell Williams and Jerick McKinnon to top 20 finishes in fantasy. I mean, those guys were journeymen, like nobodies in the NFL, and he took them into top 20 running backs. And then you throw in the fact that Antonio Gibson has been extremely productive on a per route basis among running backs. and the fact that Antonio Gibson outsnapped Brian Robinson, although only by a couple in the preseason. Antonio Gibson has been a better pass catcher throughout his career, and right now he's going as the running back 33 in drafts. He's finished as the running back 12, the running back 13, and the running back 27. All he's done is outproduce that, and I think that he just has a higher ceiling because we've seen him do it before as a top 12 running back, I know, again, Brian Robinson's in his second year. He's still going to get better, and I'm very in on him. But I think that Antonio Gibson is the guy that, one, they never talked about positively last year, and then multiple coaches have called him a matchup nightmare and that we need to get this guy more involved this year. Completely opposite to what they were saying last year. So for those reasons, that says to me that they're starting to kind of buy in a lot more in what he's doing, and I think that Eric Bieniemy is a big reason of that.
We know a passing attack here. Anthony Richardson I think we're all concerned in his short-term, at least reliability as a passer. His over/under passing yards lines in most sports books is 2,800. That makes Michael Pittman a concern because if Richardson's projected by sports books essentially to throw for less than 3,000 yards, how does Pittman get there? Last night in that FFPC main event draft I was talking about before, we were in a spot where we actually discussed Pittman, and to say that our enthusiasm was low is an understatement. Why are you concerned with Pittman this year, Alex?
Yeah, well, I think it really stems just from the fact of like history for what the Colts are projected to do compared to like what he's going to do. So for me, like pretty much in fantasy football drafts, like I look at every wide receiver and say, do they have a nightmare range of outcomes where they can finish in the top 12? And I don't think Michael Pittman does. I think there's a lot of guys after him that do. And here's why. I mean, I looked at every top 12 wide receiver over the last decade and just two simple stats: pass attempts and team scoring. And over the last decade, there was one top 12 wide receiver that came from a team that was outside the top 20 in pass attempts and team scoring. It was AJ Green in 2016. And right now, the Colts are projected to be outside the top 20 in both. There has been one top 12 wide receiver in 10 years from one of these teams. And then you throw in the fact that, Anthony Richardson has not had a high completion percentage. He doesn't project to be an accurate passer. Like, I mean, every wide receiver in this whole wide receiver room could die. And like, he's still just not going to see the volume that history says that he's going to produce. So yes, could dream ceiling. I mean, he finishes like the wide receiver 20. Absolutely. But I'm drafting guys that can finish in the top 12.
Michael Pittman was actually the wide receiver 23 per game last year in PPR leagues. Wide receiver 23 when the Colts threw the 8th most passes in the NFL. I think I put borderline my life savings on the fact that if Anthony Richardson starts every game, they will be outside the top 8, most likely in the bottom 8 for pass attempts. So I think whatever stats you see from Pittman last year, we need to drop those considerably just on the basis of the team's going to throw probably 125 plus times fewer than last year. The content that Ryan and I put out, it's free on the33rdteam.com. You can check out my cheat sheet, the strategy guide. I called it the fantasy football game plan. 7-minute quick hitter to help you get prepped for your fantasy drafts. That cheat sheet's color coded. It's free, downloadable in the PDF. It's got my top 160 rankings, my top 12 kickers, Ryan's top 12 defenses, in-depth positional rankings for those that are in super deep leagues. Ryan also has his win-loss predictions for every division on the site. He's releasing about a half dozen articles recently covering each of the different awards markets for betting. Ryan is truly one of the best there is at betting awards markets. And I certainly read those breakdowns, and you should be too. If you have even slight interest in dipping your toes in there, you need to see how he's viewing that landscape. And then our guest, Alex Caruso, at Alex Caruso on Twitter. Download Alex's draft guide, download his cheat sheet. I have personally downloaded those myself. I have read through them. Action-packed, so many quick-hitting stats. If you like Alex's threads, this is in many ways like a better place to be able to view it, where he's centralized his best content through that draft guide, even then on Twitter. Make sure you're doing that. Now, let's turn. Great segue, everyone. We're going to turn from the promo to Rhamondre Stevenson. Now, our audience is probably tired because Ryan and I have talked multiple times about how we don't really like Rhamondre Stevenson that much for fantasy football. Alex, you actually have Rhamondre ranked quite highly. I have put him as a fade. I'm worried about Ezekiel Elliott's presence portending fewer goal line carries for Rhamondre. And then my other worry is that he caught a lot of passes last year. He was actually third among running backs last year in target share. But I think some of it might have been that the Patriots offense was struggling to function and that you had to dump off to Rhamondre just to complete a pass at times. I'm probably too low on Rhamondre. He finished as the RB10 in PPR fantasy points a game last year. Alex, tell me about some research you've done that indicates another pretty strong season for fantasy may be on the horizon for Rhamondre Stevenson.
I think there's three things that make me really confident. I mean, one, like I'm just addicted to drafting guys that force a lot of missed tackles. So like, again, it's not an offensive line. It's not the offense themselves. Just like when it's on them, they force missed tackles. He forced a missed tackle on 30% of his touches last year. That was the third best rate in the entire NFL. He also was on the field in those passing situations as much as anybody. There was 2 running backs in the league that ran more routes per game than Rhamondre Stevenson did. It was Austin Eckler and it was Leonard Fournette. That was it. He was pretty much on the field as an elite pass-catching running back. He led the NFL in snaps played on third down last year. But the biggest thing, and I did a study on this over the last 10 years for running backs that average just 5 targets per game. So I did use a median threshold as they had to have at least 6.7 carries a game. Like they just had to hit about 120 carries so that you take out those third down backs. But as long as they hit that carry number and they average just 5 targets per game, 36 out of 36 running backs finished in the top 24, 34 out of 36 finished in the top 12, and 64% of those running backs finished in the top 5, purely off just seeing high target volume. The worst finish for one of those running backs was the running back 16 overall. That was the worst finish for a guy averaging 5 targets. So that says to me that, like, yes, like, sure, like, what if they stink? Their offense stinks. Zeke gets touches. Okay, that's fine. But, like, he's going to see at least 5 targets a game, which means that his floor would be about running back 16. And with the usage that he could get if they throw Zeke to the wayside and they give him more touches, would be like a top 3 running back overall ceiling. So it's high floor, high ceiling, and I think that he's the centerpiece of their offense.
Yeah, I've been seeing him go in the 4th round lately, which is I'm a little bit more intrigued than I was at his previous cost in like the 30th range, but I'm buying a little bit of him now myself. Now, I like Jonathan Mingo as a deep wide receiver dart throw in season-long leagues. Wide open wide receiver room in Carolina. I like Bryce Young as a passer, very throws with anticipation, very good play extender. I could see Mingo peaking late when we win money in fantasy football leagues in the second half. And as Josh said in his article that he wrote this offseason, rookie wide receivers are a cheat code in fantasy football. That's what we're looking for. The peak in the second half. Now, Alex, give us a late round wide receiver that you like.
Well, if I can give 2, I'll give one that's like late round and then one that's like way later round. I mean, the first one has to be Jordan Addison. Like I think Jordan Addison is ranked inside the top 24 wide receivers for me. That's ambitious, absolutely. But like people don't realize how good the role that he's taking over is with like Adam Thielen. I think he's going to take it over very, very, very quickly. I know that people are like, oh, KJ Osborne. But remember when Justin Jefferson was like playing behind BZ Johnson? Like these beat reporters, you can't trust anything that they're saying in terms of like guys that are running ahead. But as far as Jordan Addison goes, Adam Thielen last year ran the 2nd most routes in the NFL behind only Justin Jefferson. He's on the field as much as any player. That alone is something you want for fantasy, regardless of like his production profile. Number 2, Adam Thielen in that role had the 5th most red zone targets. Doesn't mean they're automatically going to Jordan Addison, but like they like to throw to their wide receivers in the red zone, which is very important for fantasy football. And the fact that there's been a rookie wide receiver to finish top 24 in 11 straight years. Like it's going to happen this year. It's just like it's a matter of fact whether who it is. And then Jordan Addison is like the perfect guy to be able to do that on this team that could throw even more now that they don't have Dalvin Cook, and I'm not really sure they actually trust Alexander Mattison. If you want to go a little bit later for a guy outside the top 50, it's got to be Nico Collins. I mean, there was no team that had more vacated targets than the Texans. They had 357 targets from last year that left their offense, which means there's more up for grabs. And Nico Collins last year went from, in his rookie year, he was targeted on 16% of his routes. He was targeted on 23% of his routes last year, which was the 20th best rate in the NFL. So you're talking about a guy that's probably still getting better, was already targeted at a top 20 rate, and then on top of that has been the favorite target of the rookie quarterback, CJ Stroud. And like fits this alpha wide receiver size that we're looking for. So it's a wide receiver 1 on a team with a lot of vacated targets that's just increased his target rate to a top 20 number last year. Like, I know that the production has not been there, but when you're outside the top 50, this is a legitimate team wide receiver 1 that you can get at that range. And that's something that I'm willing to bet on in fantasy football. And at worst, I just grab someone else off waivers a few rounds later.
I like it. Now, if we turn to the other most important position in fantasy, the running back position, I know the three of us believe in filling the back of your fantasy roster with some backup running backs. And that's really important because Alex, you mentioned earlier, like we want our roster to get better as the season goes along. Those are often the types of players that help your roster speed up and accelerate while other teams kind of stagnate and they just don't really have those bench reinforcements. You and I both like James Conner. And I think another fun backup running back stash that is going to be available in the last round of literally every draft is Keontae Ingram. The third running back on the Cardinals is Corey Clement. Corey Clement hasn't hit 40 touches since 2018. That was 5 years ago. Keontae Ingram's 215 pounds. 3 of his 4 college seasons, he hit 22 receptions. We talked earlier, if a guy's not going to get a lot of goal line work, which the Cardinals running backs may not, you want them pass game involved. Ingram is definitely a competent enough pass catcher. Alex, hit us with a fun backup running back that you think should be like a priority bench stash.
Let me give you 2 for the same reason. And this is not fun because like this is like not something that I want to like root for. I'm not going to be rooting for, but I'm just playing the numbers game by drafting these 2 guys. And it's Jahmyr White and Tajay Spears. And just forget about them as prospects because touches matter more than anything else at the running back position. Coworker of mine at 33rd Team, Ben Wolby, helped me do a study on this. And of the last 10 years, if you just look at running backs that finished top 3 in touches, only 9 of the 30 running backs to be top 3 in touches finished as a top 10 running back the following year. And it's usually not because touches just disappear. It's usually because there's some sort of injury. If you even look at the overall touch leader, the number 1 guy, there's only been 1 running back to lead the NFL in touches that finished top 10 the following year. There's only been 2 to finish in the top 20. And Josh Jacobs was the guy that was top 20, led the NFL in touches last year. So it's been a 20% hit rate for a running back to finish top 20. That says to me that the backups are going to be playing some games. So purely off the numbers, and that less than 33% of those top 3 touch leaders end up finishing inside that top 10. I know it's like a tongue twister. Point being, like, more often than not, guys that led the NFL in touches the previous year end up missing games. And for that reason alone, I'm going to be taking Jahmyr White and Tajay Spears, just playing the data. I hope that the guys stay healthy, but data tells us that those guys are more likely to miss games than some other running backs.
Yeah, I'm heavy on both of those guys in best ball myself, Alex. Sticking with the running back position, the Jonathan Taylor situation is kind of a mess, especially for the Colts. You have a rookie head coach in Sean Steichen, rookie quarterback like we discussed in Anthony Richardson. Now all of a sudden the best skill position player in the team wants to get traded. The Colts gave him a deadline of Tuesday to find a trade partner. Like there's all sorts of directions this can go. If Taylor goes to the Dolphins, which they've been linked with this since the beginning, he suddenly becomes very interesting in fantasy football. He goes to an elite offense, well coached, good scheme fit. He's primarily a zone runner. The Dolphins are primarily a zone team. I've bought the dip on Jonathan Taylor in tournaments recently. I've been buying him in the mid-3rd round to the point where I'm actually a little overweight on Taylor in best ball, where I was at 1-2% a month ago. So I've been buying the dip. How are you handling Taylor in his uncertain situation in fantasy football?
Well, I'm just not drafting a defense or kicker in redraft leagues, and I'm just taking like Evan Hull and or Deion Jackson at the end of my drafts because like a lot of times like you can get like top 5 production from defenses or kickers just by streaming and finding whoever's the best one on waivers because no one's ever rostering 2. So chances are there's like 20 of them on waivers every week. So for that reason, it gives you the flexibility to draft extra guys like Evan Hull or Deion Jackson. I would probably lean Evan Hull, who I think would probably be the more likely to be the running back one for the Colts over a Zach Moss or Deion Jackson, who I just don't really like as players enough. And Evan Hull projects more as like a better pass catcher, a little bit more upside for this team that I think will be trailing in a lot of games. And simply put, like, again, I'm drafting those guys because if Jonathan Taylor gets traded today or tomorrow or another day, like those guys could immediately be the top running back on a team that does not have a lot of competition for touches.
I think the team likes those guys. Zach Moss has the broken arm. Kenyon Drake was worked out by the Colts and they cut him, I think that actually puts a lot of confidence in Evan Hull and Deion Jackson. So I agree. I think they're both good picks. I lean slightly to the rookie long-term as well. Very, very fun prospect profile. Now, with Alex, many people first knew you from TikTok. You were one of the single biggest helps, actually, strategizing with me for how I should market and improve my content on that platform. I've had maybe half a dozen videos that went semi-viral, hitting 100,000 plus views there. For you, I don't even know. It could be 50, 100, 200 videos that have hit at least 100,000 views for you on that platform. You've even had a couple videos that reached over 1 million. And you're just one of the best out there in general at taking lots of information and distilling it down into quick hitting, actionable advice. Some people may not know that that was kind of where you started. So I think we should show off that skill. Ryan and I are going to take turns. We've got 7 questions. We're going to trade off. And you are going to be limited to no more than 30 seconds to answer any of these. Ryan, kick it off.
James Cook or Dalvin Cook?
I'm going James Cook all day. Projected to be a running back 1 on an offense that has been top 3 in scoring for 3 straight years. I don't really trust Latavius Murray or Damian Harris behind him, and I think that he could see a super high target share. Josh Allen, one of the rare quarterbacks to target running backs at an above average rate, and that target rate to running backs has gone up each of the last 3 years.
Let's talk about grinder backs on good offenses. Isiah Pacheco or J.K. Dobbins?
Well, I'm going to lean J.K. Dobbins. I know Isiah Pacheco is really interesting, but they've shown to be a little bit more heavy on the committee, where I'm a big believer in what this Ravens offense can do. And I think that when healthy, that J.K. Dobbins was a much more elite prospect. He's shown a much higher ceiling so far in the NFL. And I think that purely off of that and the fact that he might catch more passes in this newer Ravens offense that might favor pass catching running backs slightly more, I'm going to give the edge to J.K. Dobbins because he has the pass catching potential.
Alex, I've done division by division, team by team record predictions this season. I'm doing power rankings this season too. I've bet on the Bengals and Cowboys in the Super Bowl. Who do you have playing in the big dance?
Oh man, I'm a Jalen Hurts guy. He famously had said rent is due every day. I think the Eagles are going to be paying their rent back to a Super Bowl victory. And the one team that probably should have been there by now, hasn't been there by now, and has probably been due for at least 3 years, has to be the Buffalo Bills. I know it's the cheesy answer that a lot of people will have, but I think that the Eagles are going to find a way back, and I think the Bills are very due to find their way to the AFC Championship.
Ryan and I are both Tyler Conklin guys. We're Juwan Johnson guys. There's a few of these later round tight ends that we get excited about. I've held my nose a couple times recently and drafted Zach Ertz, who's somehow in his mid-30s with an above average recovery time from the ACL last year. Give us your favorite late round tight end.
Oh man, I think that this is a stat that I literally thought of going to sleep when I was just trying to sleep, and I started thinking about fantasy football, and I started thinking about Gerald Everett, because that's what I do in late in my nights apparently. But Gerald Everett's played 6 seasons. He's improved his fantasy points per game. Fantasy total fantasy points all 6 years. I don't know how that's possible. It probably just means he's really bad, but he's actually gone up every single year for 6 straight years. And you throw in the fact that Kellen Moore is now the offensive coordinator. Maybe they'll have a favorable tight end, kind of similar to that Dalton Schultz role that we saw. And I think that I'm a mega believer in Justin Herbert. And I think that maybe off of touchdowns that Gerald Everett finds his way into his first career top 12 finish.
Who's the highest scoring rookie wide receiver this season?
Oh man, it's Jordan Addison, baby. I wanted to. I would have said Jackson Smith and Jigba maybe before this wrist injury, but the more I've done my research and you look at target competition, production profiles, and the roles that some of these guys are going to be in, it's got to be Jordan Addison all day, every day, twice on Sunday.
Quarterbacks go earlier this year than they ever have before. Who's your quarterback 1 for 2023? Because if you're making an early pick, we want to make sure that we nail that early pick.
I think it's got to be Jalen Hurts. Again, Super Bowl prediction, what we had last year. Again, the Eagles were 24th in pass attempts, I believe, off the top of my head, and Jalen Hurts was still the quarterback 1 in fantasy points per game. I know he had a lot of rushing touchdowns, but they didn't get rid of the tush push. He's going to get more of those. They're going to throw the ball a little bit more. And like you said, they had the easiest schedule in the NFL. They didn't have to throw the ball. You had almost non-existent fantasy points in the fourth quarter. Again, he can start to throw the ball a little bit, play in the fourth quarter for fantasy football purposes. I think that he is going to be the quarterback 1.
The big decision at the 2-3 turn this year involves 2 secondary options in elite offenses. You taking T. Higgins or DeVonta Smith?
Oh man, that is a tough one. DeVonta Smith has had a better career high finish and is a younger overall player. With me also backing the Eagles, with me backing Jalen Hurts, I think logic would have to have me side with DeVonta Smith here. But again, like I mentioned, higher career fantasy finish, and he is younger. I'm going to go with him because he's been able to do it on a lower volume passing offense as well.
There you go. Producers in my ear, they're saying get Alex a Gatorade, give him a little rest and recovery. You went through all 7. That was great. Now, I hinted a little bit about your early TikTok days, the success that you've had there. There's actually 2 things that I've always admired about you. And before I'll say that, we checked pre-show, our first DMs. You reached out to me in June 2021. So it's been a little over 2 years now that we've been following each other's work. So the growth I've seen from you since then has been incredible. And I think there's been 2 things that are consistent with you month after month, year after year, that have helped you get to where you are. One of them is your work ethic. You recently graduated from college. I think a lot of people that follow you on Twitter would have had no idea you were still in college. That maybe they knew that you weren't a particularly old person, but then they were like, oh, he probably dropped out of college. How would he ever balance this? And then on top of all the work that you did in college and that you do in the fantasy industry, you've had a non-fantasy football job this entire time as well. It's truly impressive. And then I think one behind the scenes thing that I've noticed is you always ask questions and you always want feedback. Work ethic and a desire to take in and learn from mistakes, just ways to kind of how do I take what I've been doing and keep the momentum? How do I keep growing? I think those are kind of the 2 biggest drivers behind your success in so many ways. So anyone out there that wants to follow in your footsteps and is listening in, give us a few pieces of advice that have helped you and that you think can help other people that might be the next Alex Caruso in whatever way that ends up taking shape.
Oh man, I don't know if I wish anyone upon that. In all seriousness, I think the biggest things were just like, don't be afraid to reach out to people. Was number 1. Like I was shocked. Like when I had literally like maybe 20 listeners for my first season of podcast per episode. Like it was non-existent. It was probably my mom and all her friends, or my dad and all his friends. The point being, like I was never afraid to ask someone for help. And I think that I found that a lot of people that I had on my podcast that were like bigger names were always willing to like give me like 30 minutes of their time to just come on my podcast and get to know me. And I think off of that, like the other thing that I always ask is like, what can I do better with every opportunity that I get? And to this day, I mean, like every guest I've ever had on my podcast or every person I ever talked to, I always ask like either like, what's your biggest advice to someone that's like my age or 22? Or I'm asking like, what can I do better if we did a podcast or I read an article or a tweet or whatever it is? It's always like, how can I do better? I think just off of those things alone, you get enough answers. You definitely learn a lot when you ask someone's biggest advice to 5 years ago, or you ask them how you can do better. You'll always get really good answers. And I think it's really just off of that, just not being able to afraid to work hard, reach out and always ask anyone that can possibly give you an answer of like where you can be better.
I like that. Let's stick with the importance of feedback. Ryan, what's the most helpful feedback that you've received this past year?
This is more of a long-term lesson that took a different leap this year, but I grew up with, I think he works on MLB.com now, Mike Petriello. He does the home run derby and such. So when I first got into content, I asked him for advice, and to paraphrase Mike here, just like get to the point, keep it short. And every year I've gotten better at that. But this year, Josh, this offseason, we co-authored a few articles in February, March, where I'd say from a leadership and a management standpoint, one of the things that I do very well is I figure out where to fill voids, and I can adapt and plug those holes, so to speak, where when you're co-authoring with someone, it kind of has to read like one piece, not 2 different guys operating in the same, space. So I had to kind of match like your brevity in certain areas. And that's, I think I've taken that and been even more brief so far this year. Concise, I can talk for hours about football if you want, but most of our users don't have that kind of time. So giving them the most information and the shortest package, and this is something you do very well, Alex, is something that I continue to get better at. And I feel like I've taken another leap in that area this offseason.
We've gotten through a many page show sheet now in under 45 minutes. Congrats to everyone. Before we get to the final question of the show, which is Alex's favorite running back in 2023 drafts. Reminder one more time to follow Alex Caruso at Alex Caruso on Twitter. Ryan Reynolds is at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. The work from Ryan and I is on the33team.com. All of our content there is free. Alex's draft guide, you can see it on his pinned tweet. That is also free. We are not recommending that you pay for a single thing today on the show, just that you listen and support us by consuming our content, by engaging with the work that we're doing. And when you get Alex's draft guide, you're going to see there was too much to talk about. We could have patted each other on the back about why we all love quarterback Justin Herbert, why we're maybe fading borderline future Hall of Famer DeAndre Hopkins, why we all think Elijah Moore is primed for a bounce back. Make sure you check out Alex's draft guide. The 33rd team cheat sheet, strategy articles, those are all on the site. I'm going to be releasing the ultimate fantasy football guide very soon that will have links to all the key pieces of info and articles from this offseason in one place. Ryan and I co-authored articles on how to beat Yahoo, ESPN, and Sleeper ADP. So if your home league is hosted on one of those, we think we're setting you up to crush. And then Ryan also has his power rankings on the site. Now, Alex, I keep warming up to a certain running back in fantasy drafts with each passing day that the team doesn't bring in another veteran back. I do not believe I have seen anyone as high on this player as you are. Please tell the listeners who, at this point, I think you might have drafted him in 8 out of 9, 9 out of 9 fantasy drafts. Who is your favorite fantasy football running back for 2023?
It's got to be my guy, Rachaad White, my most owned player right now in redraft leagues. But it goes off a few things. I mean, first of all, just listen to the coach speak. I mean, his offensive coordinator had said a month ago that they view him in a 3-down role this year. The reporters on the team have consistently, multiple reporters have talked about how much they love him, the role that they view him in. And then you look at the fact that, what did he do in college? He was number 1 in his, receiving grade, PFF receiving grade coming out of college. And then his quarterback, Baker Mayfield, threw to running backs at the highest rate in the NFL last year. Cam Akers or Christian McCaffrey or not, he was still the number 1 guy. But beyond that, I know Scott Barrett had probably the tweet of the century on Rachaad White, that there have been just 5 Power 5 running backs to ever average over 90 rushing yards and 40 receiving yards per game in a college season. Those running backs, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Joe Mixon, and Todd Gurley with Rachaad White. That is the entire list. 3 out of 4 of those guys have finished as the running back 1 overall in fantasy football. Joe Mixon is a top 3 running back. Rachaad White would be the first one on that list to not have a top 3 overall fantasy finish at the running back position. That's pretty crazy. And you can get him at running back 29 in potentially the cheapest 3-down role in fantasy football. His toughest competition right now is probably undrafted free agent Sean Tucker. Outside of that, Rachaad is the guy for me all day, every day.